Edition of the magazine, but also the online edition of the Weekly Standard, which you could go to every single day. They post plenty of great stories and videos and analysis. And before he got into the media angle and aspect of everything that he's doing now, Bill Kristol, he led the Project for the Republican Future, where he helped shape the strategy that produced the Republican takeover of the Congress in 1994. You may recall that little event, ladies and gentlemen. Prior to that, Bill Kristol served as Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle in the George H.W. Bush administration, of course. And prior to that, he served as Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, in the Reagan administration. And before coming to Washington at all back in '85, Bill Kristol was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And I got to admit, I have a very strong personal bias in favor of Bill Kristol, not only because of what he does and what he stands for and what he says, but he does it, he stands for it, and he says it quite often on my show. So Bill and I, I'm fortunate enough and blessed enough to have a great relationship with him. I always look forward to what he has to say. And now we'll all get to hear what he has to say right here in this room. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Kristol.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's great to be here, back in New York City. Thank you for having me here. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan, across the river. Not the real New York, not like Queens. I came here a lot. I came to Mets games, you know, and explored the outer boroughs, you know, the hazardous trip through the tunnels and over the bridges. It was very exciting for a kid from Manhattan. But I grew up on the west side. Bella Abzug was my congresswoman. You remember her in the 60s? Yeah. That's why I became a conservative. People like to pretend that they become conservative or liberal because they read books and think deeply about these issues, but often it's just dislike of the other side, you know. And growing up with Bella Abzug as my congresswoman was very good experience for me. I then went to Harvard. I was still at that point a kind of conservative Democrat, a Scoop Jackson Democrat. You might remember him, the senator from Washington, a great Cold War hero and very pro-Israel, sort of liberal on domestic issues. I began my successful political career as an undergraduate at Harvard in 1972. I worked very hard for Scoop Jackson, gave out leaflets in shopping centers and stuff around Cambridge and Boston. He ran 7th in the Massachusetts primary. He ran behind Wilbur Mills, if you remember him. So that was great. Then I became a Republican. I couldn't vote for McGovern, so it was my first election. So I voted Republican. I voted for Richard Nixon. I'm still sort of proud of voting for Nixon in my first election. I like to say that on TV, and people go, heads explode, you know. Harvard, it was a minority view of the Harvard student body that year. They did a poll in the Harvard Crimson in October of 1972. George McGovern, the Democratic nominee, had 92% of the vote, I think. Eldridge Cleaver, the Black Panther candidate, had 5% of the vote, and Richard Nixon had 2.5%. It was good. It got me off to a good start being a minority. So it's tough being a Republican in Queens, but worse being a Republican in Manhattan or in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I ended up teaching back at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard from 1983 to 1985. They like to have one Republican, one conservative on the faculty at all times, so the kids know what it looks like. When they graduate, they have job interviews and stuff. To give you a sense of politics in Cambridge, if you ever get a little bit down here in New York City and the political situation, in Cambridge, we lived in the 8th Congressional District of Massachusetts. Tip O'Neill was the congressman. He was Speaker of the House, revered figure up in Boston, totally Democratic congressional district. It had been John Kennedy's district, actually, back in the early 50s. And I remember voting in November '84, and I voted for Reagan, obviously for re-election to the presidency. And of course, he carried Massachusetts, as he did every other state but Minnesota that year. I voted against John Kerry in his first Senate race. I'll tell you a story about that. So I saw Senator Kerry, or I guess now Secretary Kerry, but I saw him when he was Senator Kerry in, I don't know, 05, 06, after he lost the presidential race to Bush. And he vaguely remembered I had some Harvard and Massachusetts connection, so he was making small talk, as politicians do, and it was nice, and then the green room at Fox or something. And he said, did you have some connection up at Harvard? Maybe we met up there once. And I said, we did actually meet once or twice. He'd been lieutenant governor, I think, before being senator. He had been on panels at the Kennedy School and whatnot. And I said, we met each other, and in fact, Senator Kerry, I said, laughing, I voted against you in your first Senate race. Well, maybe you're not aware of this, but John Kerry does not have a great sense of humor. He looked down at me and sort of said, you voted against me? And I said, of course I voted against you. I was a Reagan Republican. It was nothing personal. He won by, 10 points anyway. He looked at me and said, Bill, shaking his head, Bill, my opponent was really not well qualified for the office. Gee, lighten up, Senator Kerry. Anyway, I did my best, and I voted against Tip O'Neill for Congress, even though I knew it was hopeless. And I remember the next morning, Susan had the Boston Globe open at the breakfast table. This is pre-internet, so you had, we knew Reagan had won, of course, we knew Kerry had won, but I was curious how many votes the Republican running for Congress against Tip O'Neill had gotten. And Susan, I said, how many votes did the Republican I voted for get? And Susan looked at the Globe and kind of looked again and said, I hate to tell you this, there was no Republican running against Tip O'Neill. And I said, I know I voted for someone. It turned out I had voted for the communist. It's a true story. A couple of months later, Bill Bennett became Secretary of Education at the beginning of Reagan's second term, and he called me, I knew him slightly, and asked me to come work for him for a year. And I remember, I said I'd be, worked it out with my wife, kids, and we move. And then I remember coming down for a job interview in the Reagan White House. You have to get cleared by the White House, obviously, when you get one of these political appointments, because they don't want the cabinet secretaries just appointing, friends or good-for-nothings or people who will embarrass the president or something. So I remember going in for my interview, I was a little nervous, and the very formidable woman, the deputy director of presidential personnel, named Becky Norton Dunlop, a nice woman, it turned out. Later I found out, but sort of tough, and she was kind of the enforcer of Reaganite orthodoxy. She made sure that the Reagan administration was people with strong conservatives and not people who would, get nervous when things got tough and so forth. So I remember going in for the interview, and I was a little nervous, and I remember telling her I was a strong Reagan supporter, and I had debated on his behalf at the Kennedy School, and I voted Republican, of course, all the way down the ticket in my district in Massachusetts, except I said, laughing, I tried to vote for a Republican against Tip O'Neill, but unfortunately, I said, I voted for a communist. And I'll still remember Becky's face to this day. No laugh at all, no smile. She looked at me very stone-facedly and said, Bill, here in the Reagan White House, voting for a communist is no laughing matter. And she held up my appointment for about 2 months. This is why Reagan was a great president, Anyway, so every time I then moved to Virginia, promptly now we live in Virginia, we of course have a Democratic governor. I left a state that was only electing Democrats to go to a state that I thought, well gee, we at least elect Republicans in Virginia. And as soon as I got there, the state has sort of gone downhill, and now we've got a Democratic governor, Democratic senators there, but things will change, and as they will change here, and have changed actually at the congressional level here in some of the important districts. So I'm optimistic, and let me tell you actually why, and I'll be brief, there's time for a few questions, but and then I think I'm the only thing that stands between you and the V&D's table. Which is very dangerous, it seems to me. Let me tell you why I'm confident in the future, really, as a Republican, as a conservative. First reason, history. I'm old enough, and many of us in this room are, to remember the 70s. Everything was falling apart. The economy was terrible, 20% interest rates, 20% inflation. Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Iranian hostages, just the country seemed to be in chaos. New York City certainly seemed to be in terrible shape. Couldn't be turned around. Everyone was writing very learned books about the inevitable decline of democracy, decline of the West, why societies fell apart, and so forth. And it did turn around. Now, it wasn't obvious that it was going to that. And those of us who supported Reagan, I remember this, and Steve and I have talked about this, and we both were so shaped by the Reagan experience. Afterwards, everyone decided, well, of course the tax cuts worked. Of course they got the economy going again without inflation, and when interest rates went down, and the deregulation of oil and gas worked terrifically well. But it wasn't obvious beforehand. Most, in fact, enlightened thinkers, most of conventional wisdom thought this would be a disaster. And even, honestly, us conservatives, we didn't know this was going to work. We thought it would work, but it was kind of bold, it was kind of untested, and it might not have worked, you know? Same with the build-up against the Soviet Union. There were people, serious people, who thought this is extremely risky, it'll bankrupt the country, it'll promote the Soviets into God knows what, they'll toughen up, and they'll sort of if the Cold War will go on for another 50 years, they'll be provoked to invade other countries, they'll scare off our allies. And again, these weren't foolish people saying this. This was not even just liberal people. A lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives kind of nervous and queasy about it. Excuse me. So it wasn't obvious that these conservative principles, when applied intelligently and energetically by a real strong leader, would work. And the good news is they did work. And for me, that's always been such a decisive moment. These were not just things we read about, they were things we read about in books. They were things we tried to think about ahead of time. But, you know, we could be wrong, just like anyone else could be wrong. And we had a real test case. We had a real test case in the 80s with Thatcher, with Reagan, with Helmut Kohl in Germany, John Paul II in a different way, on the moral front against communism. And we won the Cold War, really without a shot being fired. We got the economy turned around. We got the country turned around. But we didn't. I mean, President Reagan and others did. Got the country turned around in a pretty big way. And I think the same thing is true in New York, incidentally. When Rudy ran for mayor in '89 and then in '93. We published an article in 1995 in the Weekly Standard, right after we got going, saying, we're not sure that you can really get a handle on crime. The social collapse in the inner cities is so great. Crime breeds crime. The criminal justice system is inefficient. Even the best efforts just may not work. And this was by a conservative social scientist who wished people like Rudy well. He just was worried analytically that it might not happen. And look at New York now in the last 20 years. Really one of the great success stories of governance, and it's conservative governance. Rudy wasn't a conservative in every way. Bloomberg certainly wasn't a conservative in every way, but on the big things that a mayor can really affect, especially law and order and police, but also on basic economic policies, trying to encourage business, trying to not let the unions tie everything up totally, some deregulation, some fostering of entrepreneurship. They were pretty conservative. And again, it's a case study. It's a case study. Those of us who remember New York under Dickens, look at New York today, you can barely believe it. We hope, just because you're all New Yorkers, we hope that de Blasio does not succeed in taking it back to the Dickens era, but it's a serious problem. Welfare reform in the 90s, that was the main thing the Republican Congress succeeded in doing in 95, 96. Serious people said it's going to be a disaster, people will be dying in the streets, you can't get these people back to work. And again, it was a big success. So conservative ideas have been tested, and they have worked. Not every single one perfectly, and obviously they have to be adjusted to new time and a new era, but in the fundamentals of economic policy, domestic policy, foreign policy, and national defense, and especially I would say, conservative ideas have been vindicated. And that's why I'm confident in the future, if we can just carry those ideas forward, make a strong case for them, as Chris Gibson said, do so in an intelligent and compelling way, and win some elections and put them into practice. The next 2 years are going to be rough. President Obama has decided, having been repudiated twice in off-year elections, having squeaked to victory really in 2012 against maybe a not great Republican campaign, unfortunately, against him, he's just decided to go for everything he can get in terms of a liberal, or post-liberal, really, left-wing foreign policy, domestic policy, regulations, you name it. And, you know, we can complain about it. There's a limit to what we can do about it, honestly, even if we control Congress. The key thing is to stop as much as we can, do one or two things that I think we can accomplish in Congress, and then above all, elect a Republican in 2016 with a strong Republican, with a strong mandate to get the country going in another direction. I think especially I want to say a word about things Congress can do, and because they're also on my mind. Defense. As Chris knows, Congress has just marked up the budget, and there's an issue about defense spending, and it's complicated, and I won't bore you with the details, but I think I'm very worried that we've got defense a lot. Of course, there's waste in the Pentagon, and there are things that should be changed and reformed, but you can't wait to build up our core defense capabilities until we reform everything else. Sort of, if you have a terrible disease, you can't wait till you fix some other, you should go on a diet, and you should also get this done and that done, this elective surgery and that elective surgery, and you should change your lifestyle. But meanwhile, if you have a real dangerous situation, you've got to operate, and we're getting close to that on defense, Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense under President Obama, this is 2012, presented his last defense budget with the president. And this again is an Obama defense budget. And when they present the budget, they have the out years, so they have a 5-year, 10-year projection of what needs to be spent. Gates is, in 2012, what Bob Gates said we had to spend in 2016 on core defense was about $610 billion, which is very low, incidentally, by historic Cold War standards as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of the federal budget. This year we're going to spend, if we're lucky, and even with some accounting gimmicks to get more money in, probably around $540 billion, way below the 610 that Gates and the service chiefs thought was necessary 5 years ago. So we are really at risk now of underfunding defense to a degree that we could elect a terrific president in 2016. He could take office in January 2017. He could say, okay, let's start restoring America's standing in the world. Let's show our allies that we're serious. Let's show some strength in the Pacific. Let's also be ready to take on some problems here in the Gulf and in the Mediterranean. And of course, with another year and a half, unfortunately, President Obama, these problems could just really get worse. And look how bad it is already. Look at the news from Yemen. Look at the news from Libya. Say nothing of Iraq, Syria, everything else. And the service, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs could walk into the Oval Office and say, well, Mr. President, I would like to be able to do all these things, but we can't actually do everything that you think you can do. It's been so important to world stability over the last 60, 70 years that basically when